The universe, in its infinite wisdom and questionable sense of humor, had decided that every species should specialize in something. The Zeltharians had evolved magnificent crystalline minds capable of calculating 17-dimensional mathematics while juggling temporal paradoxes. The Vorthak had developed carapaces harder than neutronium and the charming personality to match. The Fleetlings could phase through solid matter, which was tremendously useful for avoiding awkward conversations at interstellar dinner parties. And the Mewling chorus of Kepler 44142b had perfected the art of looking so pathetically adorable that even hardened space pirates would abandon their raiding schedules to bring them tiny hats and nutritious snacks. Each species had found their evolutionary niche, their cosmic calling card, their particular brand of, "Please don't eat me, I have a mortgage to pay." Some excelled at hiding, others at running, and a precious few had mastered the ancient art of tasting absolutely dreadful when consumed. The galactic community had settled into a comfortable rhythm of mutual respect, trade agreements, and the occasional ritualistic warfare that was more ceremonial than genuinely homicidal. But nature, that persistent overachiever, had also decided that someone needed to be really, spectacularly good at ending other people's subscription to existence. Enter the Harvesters. 7 feet of biomechanical perfection, wrapped in chitin that could deflect plasma rounds, and sporting sensory arrays that could detect a heartbeat from 3-star systems away. If evolution had a suggestion box, the Harvesters were what happened when someone dropped in a note reading, "Make something that kills absolutely everything, and make it enjoy the work." The Harvester-designated Unit 774200 Omega had been manufactured, not born, because the Harvesters had long ago decided that traditional reproduction was inefficient, and frankly rather messy, in the protein vats of Terminus Prime. Its creators had installed the standard package: reflexes that operated faster than most species could think, strength enough to crush Durasteel with casual indifference, and a hunting algorithm so sophisticated it could predict prey behavior 17 moves in advance. The unit had been field-tested on 12 different worlds, from the ice caves of Proxima Centauri to the methane swamps of Wolf 3059, and had maintained a perfect success rate that would make an insurance actuary weep with joy. Its reputation preceded it like a very fast, very deadly business card. When the Harvester arrived at a planet, local wildlife typically responded with what xenobiologists had classified as aggressive extinction behavior, which was a polite way of saying everything with a functioning nervous system immediately tried to relocate to a different dimension. The unit moved with mechanical precision through its assignments, treating each extermination contract with the professional detachment of someone auditing tax returns, if tax returns occasionally tried to bite back and had to be dissolved with industrial-grade acid. The current assignment had arrived through the usual channels: encrypted data burst, payment verification, target coordinates, and a species profile that read like a grocery list. Homo sapiens, the file noted with bureaucratic blandness. Bipedal locomotion, opposable thumbs. Average lifespan 73 local rotations. Notable for excessive vocalization and tendency to form social clusters. The psychological profile was equally uninspiring. Moderate intelligence, tool use capability, exhibits standard prey responses to superior predators. Planet designation Earth appeared to be another routine extermination contract, the kind of milk-run assignment that barely registered on the unit's threat assessment algorithms. The clients, some trade consortium with a grudge against noise pollution, had filed the paperwork properly, transferred the credits punctually, and requested standard orbital cleanup protocols. Nothing suggested this would be anything other than another entry in the unit's mission logs, filed somewhere between cleared Antarian nest worms and resolved bacterial uprising on Mining Station 7. The Harvester's transport vessel dropped out of hyperspace with the subtle grace of a meteor trying to thread a needle, positioning itself in the shadow of the third planet's single moon. Long-range scans confirmed the intelligence reports. Approximately 7 billion targets scattered across multiple continental landmasses, primitive nuclear technology, no meaningful orbital defenses, and an atmospheric composition that suggested the inhabitants had somehow managed to survive by breathing what most species would classify as industrial waste. Unit 77420 Omega performed its pre-deployment diagnostics with methodical thoroughness, checking weapon systems, sensory arrays, and the specialized neural dampeners that prevented it from experiencing anything as inconvenient as doubt or hesitation during active operations. All systems registered optimal. The unit's threat assessment subroutines analyzed the planetary data and concluded that local termination could be completed within 48 local time units, assuming standard prey behavior patterns and accounting for the usual delays caused by targets attempting to hide in structures that wouldn't stop a particularly determined house pet. As the deployment pod descended through Earth's atmosphere like a very expensive meteorite with extremely poor timing, Unit 77420 Omega reviewed the mission parameters one final time. Standard extermination protocol. Begin with population centers, work outward systematically, maintain operational efficiency, avoid unnecessary property damage to preserve salvage value. The same routine it had performed dozens of times before, on dozens of worlds, against dozens of species that had all followed the same predictable script of panic, flight, and eventual statistical elimination. The pod's heat shields began to glow as it punched through the upper atmosphere, carrying its lethal cargo toward an appointment with what the mission files had classified as just another routine Tuesday in the galaxy's most efficient pest control service. The deployment pod impacted the surface of Earth with all the subtlety of a dinner guest arriving 3 hours early and demanding to know why the silverware wasn't properly arranged. Unit 7742 Omega emerged from the smoking crater like a particularly violent jack-in-the-box, its sensory arrays immediately cataloguing the local environment with the enthusiasm of a tourist photographing every meal they'd ever eaten. The landing site, designated by the unit's navigation systems as generic Urban Center number 1847, bustled with the kind of chaotic activity that made most species break out in hives. Humans scurried along predetermined pathways called sidewalks, apparently following invisible traffic patterns that defied rational analysis. They moved in groups, alone, and sometimes in formations that suggested either military precision or complete collective insanity. The unit's behavioral analysis subroutines struggled to categorize the data stream. Were these creatures migrating, hunting, fleeing, or simply suffering from some species-wide neurological disorder? Initial target acquisition proved surprisingly straightforward. The Harvester's threat assessment protocols identified the nearest cluster of humans and began standard elimination procedures. Its plasma cannon charged with a sound like a very large, very angry electronic bee, and the first volley of coherent energy struck with mathematical precision. The results, however, deviated significantly from projected parameters. Instead of the expected scattering behavior, that universal constant where prey species realize they're about to become an unpleasant statistic and respond with appropriate panic, something genuinely unprecedented occurred. The humans did scatter, certainly, but not with the mindless terror that the unit's database had catalogued from 847 previous encounters with inferior species. These creatures scattered with what could only be described as annoyed purpose, like commuters whose train had been delayed by maintenance work. Some humans produced small communication devices and began vocalizing rapidly into them, apparently coordinating responses with other humans who weren't even present. Others retrieved various objects from their dwellings and began constructing what the unit's tactical analysis subroutines reluctantly classified as improvised defensive positions. A few simply stood in doorways with expressions that suggested they were personally offended by the interruption to their daily schedules. The Harvester adjusted its approach, implementing suppression pattern Delta 7, which involved systematic destruction of local structures to discourage organized resistance. The plasma cannon carved through concrete and steel with satisfying efficiency, reducing several buildings to their component atoms, with the kind of thoroughness that would make a perfectionist weep with joy. Surely this display of overwhelming technological superiority would trigger the standard fear response and accelerate the elimination process. Instead, the humans became noticeably more irritated. The unit registered an unprecedented data point. Rather than fleeing the area, as any rational species would when faced with a clearly superior predator, clusters of humans began converging on its position. They arrived in vehicles that moved far too quickly for their primitive propulsion systems, carrying objects that the unit's weapon recognition protocols couldn't immediately classify. Some held long metal tubes that projected small metallic objects at high velocity, primitive kinetic weapons that wouldn't penetrate the unit's armor but demonstrated a concerning willingness to engage rather than retreat. Other humans appeared carrying containers of various liquids, which they hurled with remarkable accuracy considering their inferior visual processing systems. The projectiles struck the unit's carapace and burst, releasing chemical compounds that ranged from mildly corrosive to aggressively flammable. While none posed a genuine threat to the Harvester's defensive systems, the sheer audacity of the attack pattern suggested these creatures had somehow bypassed millions of years of evolutionary programming that should have taught them to run away from things with bigger teeth. The situation deteriorated further when the humans began coordinating their attacks with a level of tactical sophistication that made the unit's combat algorithms recalculate threat assessments 3 times in rapid succession. They used their structures as cover, concentrated fire on perceived weak points, and worst of all, they kept talking to each other. Constantly, the unit's audio processors recorded streams of communication that served no apparent survival purpose beyond maintaining morale and sharing tactical information. Most disturbing was their apparent lack of respect for the natural order of predator and prey relationships. When the Harvester eliminated individual targets with its precision weaponry, the remaining humans didn't scatter in terror or exhibit the expected psychological breakdown. Instead, they became more focused, more determined, and significantly more creative in their responses. Some began constructing explosive devices from readily available materials, while others coordinated flanking maneuvers that demonstrated an uncomfortable familiarity with asymmetric warfare principles. The unit found itself in the unprecedented position of having to actively defend against creatures that should have been cowering in whatever passed for burrows on this backwater planet. Its threat assessment systems, calibrated for encounters with sensible species that understood their place in the galactic food chain, struggled to process behavioral patterns that violated every assumption about prey response protocols. Then, as the Harvester paused to recalibrate its targeting systems after a particularly annoying cluster of humans had somehow managed to temporarily blind its optical sensors with reflected sunlight and strategically positioned mirrors, it detected a new data point that made its processing cores pause in something approaching confusion. One human approached its position directly, not fleeing, not hiding, not exhibiting any of the 247 documented fear responses that the unit's psychological warfare database had catalogued from previous encounters. This individual walked towards 7 feet of biomechanical death machine, with the casual confidence of someone approaching a customer service counter to complain about a defective appliance. The human stopped approximately 10 meters away, well within the Harvester's optimal elimination range, crossed its upper appendages, and looked directly at the unit's primary optical array with an expression that the unit's facial recognition software couldn't quite categorize. The closest match in its database was mild disappointment mixed with administrative frustration, which seemed highly improbable given the circumstances. The Harvester's targeting systems locked onto this new threat, weapon systems cycling through their activation sequences with mechanical precision. But something in the human's posture, in the absolute stillness of its stance, triggered a cascade of error messages in the unit's threat assessment protocols that had never appeared in any previous combat engagement. The human spoke a single word that would later be classified by xenolinguistic researchers as the most expensive syllable in galactic history: enough. Not screamed, not whispered, not delivered with the kind of dramatic flourish that typically accompanied last words in the unit's extensive database of final vocalizations. The human simply stated it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone informing a particularly persistent telemarketer that they weren't interested in extended warranty coverage. The word hung in the air between them like a conversational hand grenade, with the pin already pulled. Unit 7742 Omega's neural pathways, engineered for optimal lethality and programmed to process threats with the efficiency of a very violent spreadsheet, encountered something that made its quantum processors stutter. The targeting algorithms locked onto the human, weapon systems charged to full capacity, elimination protocols standing by for execution. Standard operating procedure dictated immediate termination of the target, followed by systematic processing of remaining population clusters until the contract parameters were fulfilled. But the human didn't flinch, didn't step backward, didn't exhibit any of the 1,247 documented pre-death behaviors that the unit's psychological analysis suite had catalogued from countless previous encounters. Instead, the creature stood there with the unshakable calm of someone who had just informed the universe that its services were no longer required and would it please see itself out. The Harvester's threat assessment subroutines began generating error reports at an alarming rate. Every calculation resulted in the same impossible conclusion. The bipedal organism standing before it registered as simultaneously the most vulnerable target it had ever encountered, and somehow, inexplicably, the most dangerous. The human possessed no armor, no visible weapons, no enhanced physical capabilities, no technological augmentations. By every rational metric, it should have been classified as easily eliminated with minimal resource expenditure. Yet something in the creature's posture triggered alerts in subsystems that the unit hadn't even known it possessed. Behavioral analysis protocols designed to predict prey movement patterns were returning data that made no evolutionary sense. The human wasn't preparing to flee, fight, or freeze. The three standard responses that had served the unit well across dozens of successful extermination campaigns. This creature was doing something far more disturbing. It was waiting. The unit's vocal processors, typically reserved for generating intimidation frequencies designed to trigger species-wide panic responses, found themselves attempting to process a concept that had never appeared in their operational parameters. "Define enough," the Harvester requested, its synthetic voice carrying harmonics that could shatter glass and reduce most sentient beings to quivering puddles of existential terror. The human tilted its head with the kind of patient expression typically reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children. "Enough shooting. Enough destruction. Enough of this entire ridiculous tantrum you've been throwing for the past hour." The creature gestured toward the smoking ruins of several city blocks, with the casual dismissiveness of someone pointing out a minor housekeeping oversight. The Harvester's combat algorithms tried to pass this response and returned results that violated several fundamental principles of predator-prey dynamics. According to its psychological warfare database, targets facing imminent termination were supposed to beg, bargain, or attempt last-minute negotiations for survival. They weren't supposed to critique the professional conduct of their executioner, like a disappointed supervisor conducting a performance review. "This unit is fulfilling contractual obligations," the Harvester replied, its vocalizers adding subsonic frequencies that had previously induced cardiac arrest in 17 different species. "Resistance is statistically irrelevant." The human's expression shifted to something that the unit's facial recognition software reluctantly classified as amused pity. It was the look of someone watching a toddler try to operate heavy machinery, equal parts entertainment and concern for everyone's safety. "Contractual obligations," the human repeated, somehow managing to make the phrase sound like the punchline to a joke that everyone else had missed. "Someone hired you to come here and start shooting up the neighborhood because they were annoyed at us. And you thought this was a reasonable career choice." The unit's processors encountered something unprecedented, a logical paradox that its decision-making matrices couldn't resolve. The human was treating the situation not as a life-or-death encounter with an apex predator, but as a customer service complaint. It was discussing the unit's professional conduct as if they were colleagues reviewing a project proposal, rather than predator and prey engaged in a fundamental struggle for survival. "Species classification indicates standard prey responses," the Harvester stated, though its confidence subroutines were beginning to generate uncertainty warnings at unprecedented rates. Your behavioral patterns deviate from established parameters. The human actually smiled at this, which triggered every alarm the unit possessed simultaneously. Prey species weren't supposed to find their impending termination amusing. The expression conveyed not fear, not resignation, but something far more troubling: genuine disappointment in the unit's performance. Standard prey responses, the human mused. You know what your problem is? You've been picking on species that actually wanted to be left alone. We're not like that. When someone shows up uninvited and starts breaking our stuff, we take it personally. The unit's tactical analysis systems began processing this statement and immediately encountered computational errors that shouldn't have been possible. The human was implying that its species didn't simply fight when threatened. They took offense. The distinction was subtle, but carried implications that made the harvester's strategic planning algorithms crash and restart 3 times in rapid succession. You are prey, the unit stated, though its voice modulation software seemed to be having difficulty maintaining the proper intimidation frequencies. This unit is apex predator. Galactic classification protocols are unambiguous. The human smile widened, revealing small white calcium deposits that served as primitive mastication tools. In any reasonable universe, this display should have registered as pathetically ineffective compared to the harvester's razor-sharp mandibles and acid-secreting venom glands. Instead, something about the expression made the unit's self-preservation subroutines, systems that hadn't activated once during its entire operational history, suddenly begin running diagnostic checks. Apex predator, the human repeated thoughtfully. That's adorable. Tell me, how many species have you hunted that built tools to split atoms just because they were curious what would happen? The question hung in the air like a philosophical time bomb with excellent timing. Unit 7742 Omega's processors attempted to formulate a response and discovered that its extensive database of species classifications had somehow failed to account for creatures that split atoms as a recreational activity. The unit's threat assessment algorithms began recalculating, with the desperate efficiency of an accountant discovering that all the numbers were written in invisible ink. Furthermore, the human continued with the relentless cheerfulness of someone explaining a particularly obvious point to a confused intern. How many of your previous prey species had actually reached the top of their planetary food chain by systematically eliminating everything that tried to eat them? Because that's kind of our whole thing. The harvester's neural pathways, designed for optimal battlefield performance, found themselves processing data that violated every assumption about the natural order. Apex predators were supposed to be apex predators because they were biologically superior, bigger, faster, stronger, more heavily armed. They weren't supposed to achieve that status through sheer bloody-minded determination and an apparent willingness to turn everything in their environment into weapons. Species analysis indicates primitive technology, the unit stated, though its voice modulation software was having difficulty maintaining authoritative frequencies. Nuclear capability is classified as early-stage development. The human's expression shifted to something that the unit's recognition software had to classify as disappointed teacher explaining why the student's homework was inadequate. It was a look that somehow managed to be more unsettling than facing down an entire battle fleet. Early-stage development, the human repeated, with the kind of patient exasperation reserved for explaining basic concepts to artificial intelligences with delusions of adequacy. We've had nuclear weapons for 80 years. We've been to our moon. We've sent probes to other star systems. And that's just the stuff we do when we're bored. You want to know what we do when we're actually motivated? The unit's tactical analysis systems tried to process this information and returned results that made its self-diagnostic protocols question their own existence. According to its calculations, any species capable of achieving nuclear technology should have either destroyed itself through warfare or transcended physical conflict entirely. The idea that a species could develop weapons of mass destruction and then simply continue existing while maintaining an active interest in violence was outside its programming parameters. This unit has eliminated species across multiple star systems, the harvester stated, though something in its voice modulation suggested that its confidence subroutines were running a continuous loop of error checking. Success rate maintains statistical perfection. The human nodded with the kind of understanding expression that customer service representatives used when dealing with particularly difficult complaints. I'm sure you have. And I bet every single one of those species followed the same script, didn't they? See the big scary monster? Panic. Run, get eliminated. Standard predator-prey dynamics. Just like your manual said, the unit's behavioral analysis protocols began reviewing its mission history and discovered an uncomfortable pattern. Every previous target species had indeed followed predictable response patterns: fear, flight, eventual statistical elimination. The harvester had never encountered a species that responded to superior predators by getting annoyed at the inconvenience. Here's the thing about humans, the creature continued with the casual tone of someone discussing weather patterns. We didn't get to the top of our food chain by being the biggest or the strongest. We got there by refusing to accept that anything else deserved to be above us. Lions, bears, sharks, diseases, environmental disasters, other humans. We've systematically eliminated or domesticated everything that posed a threat. And when we ran out of natural predators, we invented new ones just to keep things interesting. The harvester's threat assessment systems finally completed their recalculation and presented results that made the unit's primary processors pause in something approaching horror. The human standing before it wasn't prey that had failed to recognize a superior predator, it was an apex predator that had temporarily mistaken the unit for a peer competitor and was now growing increasingly disappointed by its performance. Your species achieves dominance through technological superiority, the unit observed. Its analytical subroutines grasping for familiar concepts as its worldview underwent rapid structural renovation. Technology, psychology, persistence, spite. We're not picky about methods, the human replied with a shrug that somehow conveyed the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through creative application of violence and determination. The point is, when something tries to eliminate us, we take it as a personal challenge, and we're really good at meeting challenges. The unit's processors attempted to formulate an appropriate response and discovered that its programming contained no protocols for situations where prey species revealed themselves to be disguised apex predators with anger management issues. The entire conversation had violated so many assumptions about galactic hierarchy that the unit's decision-making matrices were operating in continuous crisis mode. Additionally, the human added with the helpful tone of someone providing customer feedback, your employers hired you to eliminate 7 billion of us because they were annoyed at our noise levels. Do you have any idea how spectacularly that's going to backfire when word gets around that someone tried to take out a contract on the entire human race? The harvester's strategic planning algorithms ran this scenario and immediately began generating evacuation protocols for several neighboring star systems. A species that had reached the top of their food chain through systematic elimination of threats was unlikely to respond to attempted genocide with forgiveness and understanding. This unit requires mission parameters revision, the harvester stated, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested its confidence in standard operating procedures had undergone catastrophic structural failure. The human smiled again, and this time the unit's self-preservation subroutines correctly identified the expression as genuinely dangerous. Smart choice. Word of advice for your next career move. Maybe consider pest control for species that actually are pests. We're more in the fellow apex predator category, and we really don't appreciate being treated like vermin. As Unit 7742 Omega began calculating withdrawal vectors and composing what would undoubtedly be the most unusual mission termination report in Harvester history, it reflected on the uncomfortable lesson it had learnt about assumptions, food chains, and the inadvisable nature of accepting contracts to eliminate species that had evolved beyond the point where being hunted was anything more than a minor scheduling inconvenience. The universe, it seemed, still had a sense of humor. It just wasn't particularly kind. The harvester's communication array activated automatically, transmitting a priority message back to the contract administrators with the kind of urgency typically reserved for imminent stellar collapse events. The message itself would later become required reading in advanced xenobiology courses across the galaxy. Mission parameters fundamentally flawed. Target species classification requires immediate revision. Recommend reclassification from standard prey to fellow apex predator with psychological issues. The human, meanwhile, had pulled out one of those primitive communication devices and was speaking into it with the casual efficiency of someone ordering lunch. "Yeah, it's handled. Tell everyone they can come out now. And someone might want to call the city about those craters. I think this counts as an infrastructure emergency." As the unit's systems began the complex process of admitting that everything it had believed about galactic hierarchy was fundamentally incorrect, it couldn't help but notice the other humans emerging from their various hiding places. They didn't look like survivors of a near-extinction event. They looked like commuters whose train had finally arrived after an annoying delay. "A more final question," the Harvester ventured, its curiosity protocols overriding its rapidly diminishing sense of professional dignity. "How did your species determine that direct confrontation was the optimal response to superior force?" The human considered this for a moment, then smiled, with the kind of expression that suggested the answer should have been obvious. "We didn't think it was optimal. We just figured that if something wanted to eliminate us, we might as well find out how hard it was willing to work for the privilege." Unit 77-4200 Omega filed this response under "Reasons Why the Universe is More Complicated Than Previously Calculated," and began composing its resignation letter.